Well, I'm very honored to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. And I want to thank, first of all, two of the mainsprings of the initiative in global political economy, Jeremy Green and Greg Schwartz, for thinking of me and inviting me, and also Alison Oldfield, who I don't think is here, who's made a lot of effort to welcome me and make the arrangements. And thank you to the Dean for his very kind introduction. The lecture that I've put together is an attempt to address what I think is one of the most vibrant areas in the field of social sciences and, in fact, in humanities, as well as in law. It's called Global Political Economy, and what I'll try to do is to give some indication to those of you who are not familiar with that field, what it might entail, and some of the issues and questions which might be of relevance when we think about how it can be a guide to explaining world order questions and the future direction of global society. So I'd like to try to make some suggestions, and they're only suggestions, as to what might research in this field look like, and also how it connects to what I call critical pedagogy. And I will try to give you a sketch of some of the constitution, the contradictions, and the governance of actually existing capitalism in the early 21st century, and I'll try to highlight some of its impacts on politics, society, and the integrity of the biosphere. And in conclusion, I'll pose the question, what should be done about these things, both politically and also in terms of our research interests. And I will argue that a critical historical perspective on global political economy must be grounded in a comprehensive problématique of our times. We have to look with a cold and clear eye at the real conditions of existence that we are facing, and analyze those conditions, and do so by integrating concepts from a variety of different fields: ethics, geopolitics, sociology, cultural studies, international and constitutional law, in order to grasp these realities and bring them together in some umbrella field, and we'll call that, for the sake of argumentation, global political economy. And I will use that to address what I call the geopolitics of capitalist market civilization. So here's the outline of what I propose to try and cover today. First of all, I'll elaborate a little bit more on a critical historical perspective. Then I'll link that to ontology, that is, the study of actually existing reality. I link that to a notion which I've been developing in my work now for quite a long time, which is a concept of organic crisis. A lot of people talk about the security crisis, the humanitarian crisis, the economic, the financial crisis, etc. But in fact, there is a concatenation of simultaneous crises of society, of the biosphere, which are forming a set of problems and challenges which have to be understood, as it were, in an integrated way for us to be able to make full sense of them. So that's partly what I mean by the notion of organic crisis, and I'll elaborate that. Secondly, I'll look at some of the prevailing strategies to govern the above, and the idea that we can return to business as usual or return to a kind of normalcy under these conditions. And I'll do that by exploring some of the bailouts in response to the crisis of accumulation that followed the meltdown on Wall Street in 2008, and I'll connect that to problems of debt and monetary policy. And then I'll change the focus to something that's been ignored in many areas of political economy, sadly, which is the relationship between the development of the political economy and its dominant models of development and its relationship to the biosphere. Not just the environment, the biosphere. It's a much wider notion. It's about the sphere and its atmosphere that we live in, and also the relationship between what happens on Earth and in outer space. And finally, I'll try and offer one or two pointers towards a political methodology to address, initially at least, some of these issues at what might be regarded as a crossroads in historical development. This is a photograph of where we are. The PowerPoints were all prepared by a very gifted research assistant I have called Michele. I'm not going to reveal his full identity because people in the room might want to use him for their own work, but he's produced all the images that go with the narrative that I'm about to relate to you. Now, when I produced my first publication on in this field, it was called The Global Political Economy, Perspectives, Problems and Policies. In other words, the field was defined as something that had a series of contending perspectives. At that time, liberalism, Marxism, realism were considered as perspectives. There's very little in the field on ecology, and there was virtually no trace of feminism. Since that time, there has been a flourishing of different approaches and fields, and questions within the field, although many of the exponents of the field have stayed within the initial relatively narrow confines of the perspective that they developed. I defended my thesis in front of a woman called Susan Strange, who was a professor of international relations at the London School of Economics. And she was probably the leading figure in Britain for many, many years before she passed away in the late 90s. She was a very dear friend of mine. But she always warned me that one of the things one should always look out for in the field, and in any field within academia, are what she called the barons. People who try to monopolize or control or discipline the way in which knowledge develops. So I always warn my students and the students in the audience to beware of the barons. Because the barons may cling to a particular epistemological perspective which has limitations. And one of the examples of this is that within the United States, the field is constituted by positivist perspectives on the world, which have, I think, inherent limitations. I won't go into them now. But I always remember a very prominent American figure saying to me that critical feminism was epistemologically unfamiliar to him and therefore could be ignored. We'll get a little bit more into that as we go along. So some of the mainstream debates that we hear, I think, are really not very helpful or useful. And they fall into the category of what philosophers call the fallacy of misplaced concreteness or reification. A good example would be a long debate that's gone on in the field about the so-called American and British school of international political economy. There is no such thing as an American school, and there is no such thing as a British school. In fact, some of the figures that are in the British school are Canadians, according to some of the exponents. But really, it's not. It's almost a theoreticist kind of perspective. It's not trying to get to grips with the real questions and problems that the world really faces. And again, I can elaborate on that if need be. So what is a critical perspective? Well, this is a critical perspective that is captured by this image of a man in the revolution in Tunisia in 2011. He's holding the riot police at bay with a baguette. And Michele liked this picture because he thinks it's a way to begin to talk about the way in which critical perspectives have to demystify the relationship between rulers and ruled. And part of that demystification is actually identifying that that really exists as a relationship. Because most political science tends to ignore that fundamental relationship between rulers and ruled. And of course, in the field we're talking about, that is both local and global. So secondly, a critical perspective needs to have an ontology. It has to address the changing conditions of existence that people experience, not just at the top table, but in everyday life. And the structures of political economy need to be connected to those moments, because that is the living reality for almost all people. Now, some of the attempts to create the concepts that capture this include critical Marxists talk about the relationship between power and production, as opposed to conventional theorists who talk about the relationship between states and markets. So power and production is the lexicon of critical Marxism. I, along with Isabella Backer, who's here in the audience, tried to deepen and go beyond this by integrating critical political economy with critical feminism to talk about power production and social reproduction. Social reproduction concerns not only the reproduction of the species, it also concerns the reproduction of labor power, and it also concerns the reproduction of the institutions and processes that make production and exchange possible in the first place. Our institutions of education, health, etc. So we've tried to deepen the ontology and the problematique of political economy, and I think critical political economy in the future has a long way to go in exploring the significance of that development. So, another image. This is an image of a Spanish enclave in North Africa. So the women that are playing golf are in the European Union, and the men that are at the top of the razor wire fence are trying to enter the European Union from Africa. And many of them couldn't get over that fence. Those that did, most of them were returned immediately, and these people had to be rescued. But I think it's a kind of part of the dialectic of what is going on in the geopolitics of the world and how it relates to political economy, the question of migration, the question of human rights. So a critical perspective has to place questions of power, ethics, and justice, and indeed sustainability, at the center of their analysis. But it has to go beyond simple critique. It has to begin to go beyond and try to innovate in new ways that can help to make a practical impact. And one of the big issues, I think, is we're told there is no alternative to the way things are. Thatcher, of course, coined the famous phrase, "There is no alternative," Tina, and subsequent theorists have used this idea that when the Soviet Union and communism in Europe collapsed, we'd reached the end of history. We will never reach the end of history, because a critical perspective is concerned with the making of history, but as Marx once put it, not necessarily under conditions of our own choosing. So let's look at some of the transformations that are taking place. A container ship bringing goods from China, factories in China to Europe, and on the right-hand side are people, boat people that are trying to get into the European Union. You know, one of the characteristics of the world is that there is relatively free movement of goods and services and capital, but the movement of people is more constrained and it's hierarchically structured. So a point of departure, I think, for a critical perspective is to analyze the global situation as it actually is. And this is really what I mean by a critical ontology of actually existing capitalism and its principal, or its dominant, should I say, mode of development or model of development, which I call market civilization, which is a kind of oxymoron because a civilization based on a market can't be really fully civilized. But market civilization partly refers to what is a possessively individualist, consumerist, an energy-intensive culture and social order that is prevailing in many of the affluent regions of the world. It has a perspective on the world that's materialistic, short-term, and ecologically myopic. It has a contradictory logic, but it's sustained partly by means of prevailing geopolitical arrangements, which include strategies of policing as well as the use of and deployment of military power. It has emerged in the context of a geopolitical situation in where communism and the lefts more generally have weakened, and partly in consequence over the past 30 years, there has been a remarkable global restructuring of power. It's reflected in a myriad of different ways in government, culture, and these broader transitions in the conditions of existence under the guise of what is normally called neoliberal restructuring of capitalism. It has been characterized by extraordinary and intensifying inequality, as well as accelerating concentrations of capital and wealth in the hands of a small number of giant corporations, and ultimately in the holdings of a tiny proportion of the world's population, which I would call a global plutocracy, which is generally supported by governing classes that rule on behalf of capital. So I think this situation is partly reflected in the following graphics. So these are graphics that are taken from Oxfam and Forbes, the magazine that's read by many of the captains of industry and wealthy capitalists. It just shows how the concentration of wealth has developed in the period since 2000, but particularly since the global financial crisis of 2008 and subsequent. And what you can see is that during the course of that crisis, it's the diagram there on the left, on the right as you see it, the wealthiest, richest people on earth begin to capture more and more of the distribution of wealth and income in the world. So they accumulate very rapidly during a crisis which has been experienced by everyone else as a period of difficulty and deprivation. Here's that diagram in more, it's a bit easier to see it there. And you'll see that in the following year, actually 62 people had wealth equal to the poorest half of the world's population. So that concentration is continuing, or seems to have been continuing. Now, of course, you could say that these things really only give you a very partial picture, but I think they capture something that's very significant, that we have a capitalist system which is developed in a certain way that is producing incredibly unequal outcomes. The question is that sustainable politically? I'll also ask the question later whether it's sustainable in terms of the biosphere. So let's just have a look at this from the vantage point of social reproduction. This is a picture of a woman with her baby in Spain. She's trying to defend her home against eviction. Because what has been happening in Spain, and it's been happening in different ways in different parts of the world, is that what was formerly public housing is being privatized, is being sold as local governments have to sell their assets because they can't raise enough revenue and can't meet their outgoings. And many of these housing developments are bought and sold by wealthy capitalists, by American hedge funds, and that's part of the phenomenon that's been happening in Spain. So basic shelter, as well as institutions of health and education, are being privatized under these conditions, under these crisis conditions. So I think it's important to look at the consequences of those big graphic numbers at the level of the way in which people try to provide for the basics of their everyday lives. Now, looking at things from another perspective, we would say that you can see that one of the trends of the past 25 to 30 years has been the increasing concentration of capital in most of the key sectors of the world: media, computing, energy, pharmaceuticals, autos, finance. Previously state-owned or public enterprises are rapidly being privatized, and the general process is something I would call the commodification, an effective dispossession of public goods, knowledge systems, and public services. And of course, this affects people in different ways. There are tremendous inequalities, and in fact there are tremendous inequalities in the ranks of workers. If you look at the world's proletariat as a whole, for example, perhaps only 10% or less of those workers are organized in trade unions and have reasonable working conditions. They are protected workers, so to speak, who can fight for and defend their rights. The other 90% in different ways are subjected to very precarious conditions and often have no real employment rights in many cases. So there's tremendous variations in inequality. There isn't a single working class. There are tremendous variations within that. So when we analyze the consequences of these policies, we have to take into account these hierarchies, these social hierarchies. Many of the so-called unprotected workers in the world are, if you look, for example, in Latin America, are often landless peasants. Many of them have been dispossessed of their rights to land. This is an important phenomenon, for example, in Mexico. And they are forced to acknowledge the pressures of global capitalism and the institutionalization of those pressures, in the Mexican case, for example, through the North American Free Trade Agreement. But nevertheless, even though they are dispossessed and in some cases forced to migrate to urban areas or often to live in shanty towns, many of them still fight and remain and try to assert their rights of livelihood and their rights to dignity and recognition. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So these are just a series of sundry observations, but the basic point I want to make at this point is that this lecture assumes that the present crisis is very deep, and it involves more than simply a crisis of capitalist accumulation or a necessary self-correction that could be aided by macroeconomic intervention, monetary policy, for example, and bailouts. There are a set of intersecting crises of political economy, society, culture, and ecology, as well as global health, which together form a wider pattern that I call one of global organic crisis. Let me just make some observations about global governance, particularly with respect to governance of the political economy. The prevailing discourse is that global governance is tackling the problems and is seeking to return to normality following the crisis, post-2008 financial crisis. But more broadly, I just want to make a number of propositions for your consideration, and they might serve as pointers for research. First is that the World Bank in the 1990s applauded what it called the worldwide market revolution as the principal mantra for global governance and global reform. I would call that, in some respects, a counter-revolution because it's premised upon the primacy of capital and the interests of the affluent in the making of public policy and geopolitical initiatives. But the principal institutions of global governance, such as the World Bank, premise their orientation on supporting and extending this worldwide market revolution. Secondly, at the heart of this process is what I call disciplinary neoliberalism, which is a framework of political economy to intensify and extend the disciplines of capital. For example, by promoting free capital mobility, the widening of private property rights, and extending the scope of market forces in socio-economic life. It's both a stage of capitalist development and a particular form of the power of capital. And again, this is something I can go into subsequently. As Paddy said, an accompanying idea is new constitutionalism. More appropriately, we would call it the new constitutionalism of disciplinary neoliberalism because it's the legal side of the political economy framework. It's the way that that political economy framework is locked in, is juridically locked in to the laws and the constitutional structures that govern the way in which economic activity can take place. And the important thing is that many of the trade and investment agreements, for example, that are currently under discussion and debate, have constitutional status for their signatories. So these are binding requirements. Now, the important thing about this is it embodies, and perhaps Paddy could say something about this in the discussion, what I think is a very peculiar version of the rule of law. It is a rule of law that guarantees almost absolute, or certainly full, private property rights, including free entry and exit options for capital, quote-unquote so-called free trade, and full security to guarantee those rights, while simultaneously preventing democratic control over key aspects of the political economy. The commanding heights of the political economy are insulated from democratic pressures. The quintessential example is the so-called independent central bank. And I'll come on to that in discussion. So by separating the commanding heights of economic policy from any significant popular political contestation and specifically from representative democracy, new constitutionalism seeks to lock out democratic forces from the governance of the economy. So these are the frameworks that govern the notion of business as usual in the context of a situation of massive global indebtedness, both public and private, and certainly over the past decade, excessive reliance on monetary policy in response to the crises of accumulation. And again, I can go into the public-private hybrids that are involved in this situation. But what I think is important from a global perspective is that business as usual involves many of the poorest countries of the world paying up to 20% of their annual fiscal revenues to service their foreign debts, often in repayment of debts whose principal has already been repaid several times over, even where the original loans have been used to fill the coffers of dictators and potentates, now in offshore bank accounts located in quote-unquote secrecy jurisdictions. And it's important from a political economy perspective to note that the opportunity costs of this situation could be generalized and measured in terms of the expenditures foregone for social programs, for education, for healthcare, all of which have important class, gender, and racial dimensions. And indeed, the neoliberal era has been characterized by recurring financial and debt crises with devastating social and economic effects, particularly in the global south, but they have since 2010 migrated to parts of the global north, particularly the Mediterranean countries, for example, in the European Union, as bailouts were morphed into sovereign debts. And it's a complicated situation, but I think it's important to note that the world situation is one of enormous debts, and one of the, as it were, categorical imperatives of the new governance frameworks is the need to service those debts in full and on time. Now, you may recognize this gentleman. He's the person that broke the British pound in the early 1990s by betting that Britain would be forced out of the European exchange rate mechanism. And I think he made £1 billion in a couple of days. It's George Soros. But in fact, since then, he's become a bit more radical. And he has been making a number of comments on the use of monetary policy in response to the crisis. Now, the important thing about this, first of all, from the viewpoint of new constitutionalism, is that increasing numbers of central banks are now independent. That doesn't mean that they are independent in the sense that a cross-section of the population is on the governing boards of these banks. It means that private financiers, members of the banking fraternity, and economists that are beholden to that type of way of thinking about the world, assessing it, gauging, quantifying, and directing it, are on those boards. You know, the Bank of England, for most of its actual existence, was a private institution, ever since 1694 when it was founded. It's now regained that status. And it's part of a wave of changes, governance changes that have swept across the world, creating this situation where monetary policy is governed by independent central banks. And the quintessential example is the European Central Bank. Now, the US Federal Reserve is a slightly different animal, so I won't get into that, but I'll focus most of my comments on the European Central Bank. It's not governed by progressive or heterodox economists. I have a lot of good ideas about monetary policy, but I wasn't asked to join the Bank of Canada's governing board. But the independence did give these banks tremendous latitude in their role of lender of last resort to respond with massive infusions of cash alongside the bailouts in response to the crisis of 2008. And I've got some numbers here which I got from Robert Peston, the BBC business correspondent. He read a survey by McKinsey & Co. Since the 2008 crash, global debts have been estimated to have risen by 57 trillion US dollars, and government debts have increased by 25 trillion. That's up to 2005. Just to give you an idea of what that means, the USA's GDP data, according to the World Bank, is 15.5 trillion, and China is 7.5 trillion. So we're talking about very large amounts of debt. And what Soros has done is he's cut through the Orwellian language that governs these things, because this phrase, quantitative easing, it's almost like a kind of a technical thing. You know, the plumber comes round and he quantitatively eases your toilet so it flushes a little bit better. It disguises an attempt to try to provide asset holders with access to cheaper money, greater liquidity, in the hope that they will then use that to invest productively and to engineer an economic recovery, economic growth in the conventional sense. And what Soros said to the Davos World Economic Forum was that it basically transfers income and wealth from workers and middle classes and the poor to big capital and the holders of large assets. So this apparently neutral and technical term masks what is in fact an incredible process of redistribution. And he said that the Eurozone measures to transfer wealth in this way, which is simply a way of increasing, I'll quote him directly, I'm not going to misquote him, would increase inequality between rich and poor, both in regards of the countries and people. So this chart here, just underneath Soros's chin to the right, just shows the stimulus program before quantitative easing was put in place. And you'll see that the aid to the financial sector was 4.5 trillion euros in Europe, whereas the stimulus program, which is mainly for infrastructure and job creation, was 200 billion. It was a minor fraction of the money that went into the financial sector. Now, of course, the financial sector has our own savings. So, of course, no sane government could allow those institutions to simply collapse. But they could have all been nationalized, and then they could have been governed by progressive economists for the public good. But they weren't. One of George Soros's former partners now has his own hedge fund of his own. It's called Stanley Druckenmiller. He is a billionaire. He labeled quantitative easing, and I'll quote, "the biggest redistribution of wealth from the middle class to the poor to the rich ever." Now, critical political economists have another phrase for this process. It's called accumulation by dispossession. And in the European case, these are two of the trends which I think could be identified. I've been doing quite a lot of research on Europe over the last few years. But I think those two bubbles sort of speak for themselves. But the important thing is that as the pound of flesh is being paid to the financiers, to the holders of government bonds, it is always at the expense of an alternative foregone. And if governments are forced to privatize their healthcare systems, their education systems, and so on, that has important social impacts. Now, couldn't come to Bristol without quoting from one of the most famous Bristolians, who never speaks, of course, directly. He produces signs. This, I have to say, I criticize this political sociology. It's not accurate. It grossly underestimates the distribution of power in the world. So if you looked at this diagram and then you kept drawing that pyramid down about another 1,000 feet into the ground, you would again get something that would resemble the position we're in and the position of the plutocracy in the eye of power at the top of the pyramid. But it's an indicator of the inequality that's involved. And of course, Banksy is always reminding us that there is a mailed fist behind our everyday interactions. I was hoping to see some Banksy when I got here, but I think the Bristolians have covered him all up, haven't they? No? Oh. Good. Okay, just to try to change the tack of this to an area of political economy which I think is incredibly important, and it's a way for political economists to link to the earth scientists, to geographers, to the biologists, and so on. This is a photograph of a Brazilian photographer called Sebastião Salgado. He was an economist, and then he became a photographer. And he took this picture in 1991 in Kuwait when Saddam had retreated in the face of the onslaught from the American and so-called coalition forces. And they were setting alight to the oil wells in Kuwait, so the whole sky was black. And some of these wells couldn't be capped because of the bombing and so on. So, of course, they called in the experts, and as we all know, the best experts to call in are from Canada. So these are Canadian firefighters who were called in to cap these wells. And the work was so hard that at the end of each day, so hard and so dangerous, that they just burst into tears because they didn't know whether they'd survive a day. But they did, and they managed to cap the oil wells. And there is a quote from Salgado about that situation. Now, I use that image to point to the simple fact that the lifeblood of what I call market civilization, capitalist market civilization, are fossil fuels. And the accumulated use of fossil fuels and non-renewable resources is one of the key aspects of the acceleration of changes in the relationship between humankind and the biosphere that forms part of our predicament. Indeed, many leading scientists now argue that the human impacts on the planet have meant that we've entered a new geological era, the Anthropocene, the so-called human age, where human activity has massively affected the planet's ecosystems. And many of them argue that prior to 1945, which was a turning point, and indeed for over the previous 11,700 years, during the so-called Holocene era, climate change remained remarkably stable. And a scientific consensus has developed around the idea that 1945 is a turning point in these relationships. It's come to be called the Great Acceleration in contemporary transformations. And it's worth noting that 1945 was the end of World War II, and it was symbolized by the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, underlining how military factors also contribute to the ecological question. Since 1945, human population has more than doubled to an astounding almost 7.4 billion people. And the global economy has increased tenfold. I would argue at the heart of this great acceleration is the extension of global capitalist market civilization. Not all of these effects have been caused by capitalism, of course. But today, capitalism is pretty much the only game in town. And this has been linked to a commodification and exploitation of human beings and nature, and a massive increase in production, distribution, and consumption alongside a global cultural revolution. And this has been linked to a massive expansion of world trade. World merchandise exports in 2010 exceeded 16 trillion, up from 6 trillion in 2000, an amount that was already more than 100 times higher than in 1948. It's part of the global cultural revolution. It's got to be Banksy. Anyway, yes, getting back to the environmental questions, the links between them and the social problems inherent are so interrelated that any attempt to treat them as separate entities is unlikely to succeed. Could be Bristol City's fans, I think. Anyway, getting back to the more serious stuff here, many global life support systems are now endangered. Research at Australian National University, for example, has identified 9 such systems essential for human life on Earth. 2 of them, climate and the nitrogen cycle, are now in danger of falling, and a third, biodiversity, is in meltdown. Species extinction is currently running between 100 to 1,000 times faster than background levels, and it's set to further increase. So we may be living through one of the 6 biggest extinctions in the history of the planet. So while pollution has been the dominant environmental and health concern since the 1970s, it's now only part of a looming ecological disaster. Now, how does it link to the political economy of actually existing capitalism? Now, here I'll draw upon a book written by one of my colleagues at York, Robert Alberton, a book called Let Them Eat Junk: How Capitalism Creates Hunger and Obesity. The ecological problem, according to Rob Alberton, is also compounded not only by geopolitics, but by important aspects of political economy. One of the characteristics of the current accumulation frameworks is the maximization of short-term profits and time horizons amidst intense competition, which, as he puts it, has been exacerbated by the petrochemical revolution, which made profits depend increasingly on the speeding up of the rate at which commodities were produced and consumed. Now, if you look at this in terms of some of the developments in the food systems, it's quite stark. Because of this speeding up of turnover time, there has been increasing interface between genetics and animal breeding and the reproduction of agrarian systems, such as, for example, cattle. Very small numbers of super bulls provide the semen for the artificial insemination of enormous numbers of cows. And what this is doing is it's narrowing the genetic base of the reproduction of cattle and the dairy industry. And nobody knows for sure whether there may be genetic problems with these dominant super bulls that do the servicing. But everything is, as it were, engineered in order to fatten the cattle more quickly and to increase the turnover time in the market to make profits. Also this fuel-intensive and export orientation of agribusiness is also driving not only genetic but also crop monocultures and causing massive damage to biodiversity, partly because of widespread use of chemical insecticides. They're technically called neurotoxins that destroy insects, plants, and animals, things like bees, earthworms, and so on, a part of the reproductive cycle of life, and therefore undermining the long-term prospects for food security. I could also go on to discuss climate change, which is probably the single biggest problem, but I think probably everybody in the audience is aware of many of those issues. So the problem has been deepening now for 30 or 40 years as the Great Acceleration has continued, but yet our political leaders, on the whole, have been blithe in response to this and have often chose to ignore it. One of those leaders, George Bush the Elder, refused to go to the Rio Conference on the Environment in 1992 and sent a brief message saying he would not turn up because, as he put it, our lifestyle is not negotiable. Well, I've already outlined many aspects of that lifestyle. This is a picture from the 1930s, by the way, and it shows that the contradictions that are involved in these kinds of developments. So the lifestyle and associated pattern of development that Bush is referring to is by definition exclusive and can only be available to a minority of the population of the planet. Nevertheless, it is serving to consume the vast bulk of global resources whilst endangering many people and our ecological systems. All of this is contested. It's just not happening, as it were, in a science fiction movie. It's contested because it affects the very fabric of our societies, our identities, and questions about the future. It involves a dialectic of power and resistance. So I'm going to conclude with some very brief comments about the politics or the political methodology of this. And again, a famous local artist provides us with the introduction to that. What are the barriers to change? Here I follow Gramsci's famous maxim, the pessimism of the intelligence and optimism of the will, as a political methodology. If one wishes to be pessimistic, you would say that the structural power of capital is so powerful and it's embedded so much in our governance systems that it cannot be effectively challenged. It has the ability to, capital can move between jurisdictions. It can play off one jurisdiction against another. Whereas we by nature are human beings located in a particular place and time. Secondly, new constitutionalism doesn't simply write the rules for trade and investment and so on. It shapes what can be logically and possibly addressed in ordinary debates concerning politics. It shapes the limits of the possible. Is it possible to challenge private property rights, and if so, under what conditions? Is it possible to offer alternatives? Is it possible to argue for nationalization when nationalization has been prohibited or made illegal? And thirdly, reactionary forces. Austrian election, which no doubt everybody noted. But it's a worldwide phenomenon, but particularly acute in Europe because of the reactions to the migration and refugee crisis. So these are things that I think give pause and say, you know, the power structures are very difficult to change. On the other hand, you can go to the very, as it were, bottom of the sociological ladder, the very poorest people, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, for example, and you could trace, I think, in terms of recent history, many developments which show that they are capable of organizing themselves politically and imagining alternatives and actually putting those alternatives into practice, not always successfully. This is an image of the Zapatista women. They weren't just going to allow the Zapatista men to lead, and they of course, the Zapatista slogan was, "We wear masks in order to be seen." But basically what this is about, this sketch here, this postmodern Prince idea, is the idea that the new forms of global politics, both local, regional, and global, are not like the old forces of the left. They're not organized in a single political party with a single entity, and they involve considerations of gender, race, ecology, and class, and they are fluid. They're fluid and in movement. They involve many, many organizations. In a sense, you could imagine that they come together in forums like the World Social Forum. And they have been developing in recent years. And I use the idea from Gramsci's Modern Prince and apply it to the contemporary postmodern situation, because Gramsci, of course, did not really write about the ecological situation. He dealt with other issues in the 1930s. And I've called it a movement towards, or a concept of, or an imaginary of, a postmodern prince. And these are some of the characteristics that I can identify with these new forces in movement. They're plural, they're democratic, they take a long-term planetary view. Their intellectuals come from the very lowest orders of society. They basically don't have leaders in a conventional sense. And they don't necessarily have a unified response. But they have demonstrated their solidarity in real organization and mobilization. A very good example was the defeat of the attempt by Bush, the older Bush, to put into practice the free trade area of the Americas. So it has millions of leaders, including very well-educated people, scientists, professionals, educators, as well as enormous numbers of workers. And as a result, it can't really be decapitated. And it operates on the principle that many different worlds are necessary. Diversity is necessary. We need to protect biodiversity and the different ways of living on the planet. It doesn't mean to say there should be no trade, there should be no intercourse on a global level. It's not pure localism, but it's a thoughtful way to imagine, as it were, transformative resistance. So I just want to since it's the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, I have a quote from Macbeth to conclude, which I hope you will note. Macbeth is all about resistance to illegitimate power. So as Shakespeare once put it, fare you well, do we but find the tyrant's power tonight. Let us be beaten if we cannot fight. Thank you.